first speaker is Jane Poynter, and I invited her here because before there was Big Brother and before there was Real World, there was a thing called Biosphere II. It was a grand idealistic scheme, an experiment to simulate a human space colony. It was built out there in the Sonoran Desert at very huge expense, hundreds of millions of dollars, all of it paid for by an eccentric American billionaire. And Jane Poynter was one of the 8 people who, I guess, was selected, first volunteered and then was selected to go into that enclosure I've visited and lock themselves in there for a 2-year period, the intent being to experiment and see what the consequences were of not only living in a confined space, but attempting to live entirely on the elements that had already been put into the biosphere. There was a kind of little ocean, and there was vegetation which was supposed to scrub the air. They were going to grow their own food supply and in every way simulate what you might need to do if you were trying to establish a colony on the moon or a colony on Mars. Jane is one of the survivors of that experiment, and she's agreed to come out here and tell us about it. This is Jane Poynter.
Thank
you. Thank you. There's a tradition. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Moses. So I've always been infatuated by the idea of humans becoming a multiplanetary species. It is something that has engulfed my life. And I was indeed one of the people who was lucky enough to be involved in Biosphere II. This is a picture of Biosphere II, right almost from the word go, from the very inception of the idea, when Buckminster Fuller threw down the gauntlet and said to our meager little crew, if no one else is going to do it, you've got to do it. And so we did. In the Arizona desert, we built this glass and steel structure, about 3 acres, has a little miniature rainforest, a savanna, desert, marsh, ocean, and then the human habitat where we lived. And it was essentially entirely sealed in those days. It is still there today. Arizona University is using it for climate change research, fabulous research. Back then, it was really intended as a prototype for a space base. The state of the art at the time of Biosphere II, the Earth being Biosphere I, was this: a little liter sealed flask that a fellow at the University of Hawaii, Dr. Claire Folsom, had filled with algae and sand and ocean water from the beach under a contract with NASA. It was actually an astrobiological experiment looking at the origins of life and the malleability of life. Where can life be? And he then tried to kill these poor little things in there, which were only bacteria and algae, to really see what is the extent of life. But this was the very first attempt at making an entirely sealed ecosystem that would persist for extended periods of time, which was essentially what we were trying to do. NASA was doing this thing called CELS, Closed Environment Life Support Systems, which certainly were intending to replicate the systems of life, but in a completely different way. We were trying to do it with all of the complexities of life. So we had to ask ourselves very simple questions like, what is a biosphere? If you're going to seal up a biosphere and have people thrive inside that thing, what is it? Well, when you look at planet Earth, which is what we were really trying to simulate, effectively, it is, to all intents and purposes, materially closed. There's not a whole heck of a lot of exchange. There is some, but not very much exchange between outer space and the Earth. And yet it's energetically open. We have the sun that beats on the planet, and that's what drives all the biological processes on the planet, or most of them. We now know that there are ecosystems on the Earth that can thrive without the direct input from the sun. So we then went from that little tiny liter flask to this, which was 1/400th the size of Biosphere II. And the very first time we had somebody live inside that thing, almost no doctors would sign up to check out this guy before and after and be the doctor on call, because it was such an outrageous thing we were doing. We were closing him inside this totally sealed chamber with all of these bacteria and the soil and these plants, and they were concerned that he was going to get some terrible lung infection, some dreadful disease, and this was just for 3 days. Turned out it was just fine. And so we went on to design Biosphere II. Now, I got involved in the project by a completely crazy circumstance. My background is ecology. And so I was in the outback of Australia working on Ed Bass, who is the guy who funded Biosphere II, working on his cattle station. It was a really interesting environmental project that I can go into another time. And it turned out to be biospherian training, because it was out in the middle of nowhere. It was completely isolated. We were having to rely on each other, some of the Aboriginals that were there as well working with us, but it was very isolated, and it really did sort out pretty quickly those people that can handle not having a Home Depot or a restaurant or a movie theater to go out to at night, and those who can't. And here I also learned to field dress a cow in the back of a pickup, which is what we're doing there, which became very handy in Biosphere II because I was the butcher. So I also had to, poor me, go and live on a boat this is a concrete junk that I sailed across the Indian Ocean and up the Red Sea on. That was also part of this biospherian training, again, intended to be incredibly isolated. Again, poor me, I had to be on the coral collection crew. You got to fill the ocean with something. And so we actually went to an area where there had been terrible hurricanes gone through and damaged all this coral reef, and so we were able to collect the corals from it. Inside Biosphere 2, we had about 3,800 species living inside there with us. One of them was this little monkey. That was the biggest animal we had aside from the domestic animals. And then it was entirely sealed, and it was sealed by these guys at night, because it was so hot during the day, clambering all over the biosphere. We hired about every single Mountaineer there was in Tucson, of which there are quite a few, it turns out. And they injected 60 miles of seam with silicone and then vacuum tested every single square inch. And beneath Biosphere 2 was a steel pan, creating the seal underneath. And we also tested its sealing, and it turned out to be more sealed than the shuttle. So it was incredibly sealed. So in 1991, I went in to explore this new world, this little prototypical space base. And I went in with 7 other people. There were 4 men and 4 women inside, and we were really going to do the maiden voyage. We were going to test this sucker. Can you really take a biosphere that has evolved on a planetary scale, jam it inside effectively this giant mayonnaise jar that you're not going to put any holes in the lid of, and all of these different ratios of plants to animals to soil to water, and have it persist for an extended period of time? Or will something go wrong that we either can't understand or can't fix? That's what we were doing in there for those 2 years. So this is a little tour of the biosphere. There's across the ocean there, you're seeing a rainforest on the top right. Down beneath it is the whole area where we had all the pumps and the cooling systems, but there was no material exchange with those cooling systems with outside, and the human habitat inside. There was also, of course, the agriculture, because we had to feed ourselves. We were recycling all the water, and we were growing all our food as well. So we really were kings in our own little worlds. And when we had our meals inside Biosphere 2, we really thought about it in terms of biodiversity. How many different species were we eating? And we are eating cheesecake there, and it took us 4 months to make that cheesecake. So not everything went quite as planned. As you might imagine when you're doing something for the first time, there are some hitches that come in along the way. And this was really the goal of the project. And what we discovered a few months into the whole thing was that unfortunately, particularly unfortunately, seeing as this was our life support system, we were losing oxygen. And we were losing a lot of oxygen. And to cut a very long story short, it was a huge mystery for a very long period of time. It turned out, however, that it was a 2-step process. We had simply put too much compost in the soil. As it breaks down, it takes the oxygen out of the atmosphere, puts CO2 into the atmosphere. Then we weren't seeing that CO2 because it was being absorbed by the concrete that was all over the interior of the biosphere. I can tell you from an experiential point of view, however, it was pretty heinous because we were not adapting in a normal way. And we felt we let it drop down to about 14.2, which is about equivalent to being at the top up near Lhasa in the Himalayas, which isn't that bad, except if you're not really adapting to it, my goodness, it makes you feel haggard. And you kind of stagger around and you go through these terrible mood swings. And we were already not doing very well in that department to begin with. In fact, I would say Biosphere 2 really was a human experiment, very much so. Turns out that there is a whole branch of psychology called isolated confined environment psychology, because there is a constellation of symptoms that occurs to people very often that enclose themselves like this for an extended period of time. And we thought, because we were in this huge and varied and beautiful place and we could talk to our friends on the phone and we had television and all of that, that we were going to be just fine. Not so much. This picture is taken at the end of the first year, where we're all looking relatively happy. What you can't see in the picture is that actually we are broken into two warring factions. Everyone has been going through various stages of depression. There's a certain sort of paranoia that takes over as well, which is very bizarre. I mean, everybody blows everything out of proportion. And it's very common. So when we think about going to Mars or somewhere like that, this is no joke. I mean, right now there is an experiment going on where a number of people are being enclosed for 500 days, which isn't even as long as we were in the biosphere, to really study how they do as an experiment, looking forward to what it would be like going to Mars. I wish them all the best. It's tough. So after 2 years and 20 minutes, we emerged from Biosphere 2 back into Biosphere 1. And we really did feel like we had triumphed technically inside Biosphere 2. Yeah, we had the little issue of the oxygen, but we knew what it was. Joking apart, we knew what it was, and we knew how to fix it. It was incredibly simple to fix. Unfortunately, we couldn't fix it inside Biosphere 2 because it's so big, and it would have meant taking everything out and starting again. But it really did mean that biospheres, artificial biospheres, are in fact possible. So while I was inside Biosphere 2, of course I didn't have anything else to do, so I started a company. I started a company called Paragon that, with the vision of being the company that would develop the life support system for Mars. Of course, we still got a long way to go to Mars, but another biospherian who started the company with me, and a couple of aerospace engineers on the outside who were involved in the startup, we were these bright-eyed idealists really wanting to be part of this space race, the new space program. We were on our way to Mars at that time. We had all kinds of creatures, some of these creatures that you're seeing pictures here, for extended periods of time in space in their own little teeny-weeny biospheres. It was really cool, actually. The longest time we had one up was for 18 months on the International Space Station, which was really fun. And you can really tell sort of the way that life here on Earth, in so many ways, is completely gravity-driven. We've had fish in space, bees in space, all kinds of creatures in space. And the company is involved in the Orion space vehicle that is hopefully going to go to the International Space Station and then beyond into deep space, hopefully to a near-Earth asteroid. Wouldn't that be incredibly cool? We're doing spacesuits. So we may not be going to Mars, but Mars is still our guiding light. This is not a space vehicle. It is actually a system that we use for testing spacesuits, for testing all of these life support systems that people's lives will depend on in space. But there are many, many people in the world today who are working on making space a reality, on making this idea of having humans be this multiplanetary species. You've got Bigelow Aerospace that has got a space hotel, for heaven's sake. They are even already, and this isn't just an idea. Back in the day, 20 years ago when we were talking about this stuff, it was all a big hee-hee giggle factor. Oh, space tourists, living in space, isn't that very cute and funny? Well, now we actually have hardware in space, and it's incredibly exciting. There's a third prototype of this space hotel orbiting the Earth today. We've got all kinds of entrepreneurs. This one here, Excalibur Almaz, is one that's going to be putting up vehicles orbiting the Earth and eventually around the moon. Of course, I'm sure you've all heard of Virgin Galactic. They're going to be doing the suborbital flights, which only for $200,000 you can go and see the Earth from space, which I think would be incredibly exciting. And of course, SpaceX, who is not only developing incredibly inexpensive ways to get to space, which is one of the game changers for space if we can get there cheaper, also vehicles that we can then orbit the planet as well and deliver at least cargo to the International Space Station. So one of my favorites, though, is the idea of taking life as well as humans, other life into space. And another idealist, Bob Richards, who has been here talking about his project, Lunar Odyssey Moon, who is making a commercial bid for the moon. We're involved with him delivering a payload for that, as well as being involved in Odyssey Moon as well. We want to actually grow plants on the moon, which would be incredibly exciting. The first plants to really go through a full life cycle outside Earth's orbit. And that would be just an extraordinary stepping stone for us to get beyond the Earth. So when we look to the heavens and think about what's out there, and we look at all of those millions and billions of stars and ask ourselves, surely there must be life out there. There has to be. Surely we're not the only life in the universe. But of course, we don't know that. We don't know how life began on Earth. Did it come, as was talked about earlier this morning, inside an asteroid plummeting through the atmosphere and survived that hot re-entry to procreate on the Earth? Or did it spring from Earth itself? We don't know that yet. But what we do know is that Earth is the seed for life into space. And that, in many ways, is what drives me. That's the passion that drives me to go into space, is the idea of life itself. And as you go into space, you also realize that the further you get from Earth, the more you look back at Earth. Because, of course, we so often experience something when we don't have it. And in space, as yet, there is no life. And so for me, when I look at space, and I look at the stars at night, and I think, oh yeah, that is our destination, I also look back at Earth and think, and that's our muse. Thank you.
So while we're getting our picture taken, I want to ask you some questions.
Okay, then. Do I have to hold my hand behind my back? Can I hug you?
Oh my God.
Okay.
The Mars 500 experiment, which is sponsored by the European Space Agency. Right?
They're all going to go mad.
Well, first of all, it's 6 men. So you were a mixed gender.
Yep.
Right. So there are only 6 guys, and I'm bummed out on your behalf because I'm holding here a story about this project, and one of the people speaking for the project says, there never has been a simulation that has lasted so long that took place in something very similar to an actual future space capsule in which people will be going to Mars. Somebody should straighten that guy out. And did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, what's interesting about that, though, in some sense, they're completely wrong because, of course, we were in there for a lot longer in Biosphere
210 days longer.
Yeah, right. Good math. No, but what's interesting, though, is that they are going to be in a small capsule.
550 cubic meters space.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite small. And we were in 3 acres. And so one of the reasons that we thought we weren't going to have all of those problems was because we were in this huge, beautiful place. But of course, it turns out that that really doesn't make that much of a difference. What makes the difference is the period of time that you're enclosed. Mm-hmm. That's really what it is. And it all starts about 6 months. You all start going cuckoo at about 6 months.
Does the gender mix have anything to do with it? Can I ask you what the ferocious split was between the two sides that you mentioned?
The ferocious split probably would have been about anything. I mean, what it ended up being was sort of a very communal garden, science versus management, right? The scientists are right and the management's wrong. That's fairly common. It was nothing to do with gender. It turned out there were 2 men and 2 women on either side of this divide. And what's even crazier for me personally was that it also turned out that I went into the biosphere with 3 of my best friends, one of whom I ended up marrying. 2 of the other people ended up on the other side of that divide.
I see, and that had nothing to do with the conflict.
No, didn't have anything to do with the conflict.
She hesitated. One last question.
Yeah.
Did you shoot the Enterprise? Was someone clever enough to put cameras and shoot what went on in the biosphere?
So there was lots of footage taken. We did have cameras all over the interior of the biosphere. However, unlike in the reality shows we see today, we put hats all over those cameras.
So there's no record?
There is a record. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, has it ever been seen?
Yeah, some of it's been seen. There's nothing, I don't think you're going to see anything particularly juicy because we did all the juicy fighting behind closed doors.
All right, Jane. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're a sweetheart.